The town woke up every morning to two different worlds. When the sun rose, electric wires hummed softly above the red earth, carrying light into homes that still greeted dawn with prayers to the ancestors. Motorbikes rushed through narrow roads, horns shouting impatience, while old men sat under mango trees, counting time the way their fathers had, by shadows, not clocks. Phones rang, radios spoke of distant cities, yet tradition still decided who spoke first, who ate last, and who stayed silent. In this town, progress walked fast, but custom never moved aside. Among the people was a young man known for hard work and quiet strength. Each day, he left home before sunrise and returned after dark, his dreams folded neatly inside his chest like letters never sent. He respected elders, bent his head when spoken to, and carried family duty like a second name. Yet inside him lived another voice, one that whispered of space, choice, and a life shaped by his own hands. Sometimes, as he watched lights flicker on across the town, he wondered if freedom always came at the cost of respect. The family house stood firm at the edge of the street, its walls strong and its secret stronger. Inside, words were measured carefully, like water during drought. Painful memories slept under polite greetings, and questions were swallowed before they reached the tongue. In this house, silence was called wisdom. Obedience was called love. When elders spoke, younger mouths closed, even when truth pressed hard against their hearts. That afternoon, as the family gathered in the sitting room, a knock broke the routine. Not the polite knock of visitors, but a heavy one, slow and certain. When the door opened, a woman stood there with dust on her shoes and an old travel bag in her hand. Her eyes moved through the room as if counting things long forgotten. "So," she said softly, stepping inside without waiting for welcome, "this is how you live now." No message had announced her coming. No call had warned them. Yet the air shifted, as though fate itself had crossed the doorway. The young man felt it then, a quiet knowing deep in his bones. This visit was not a mistake. It was the beginning of something the family had avoided for too long. People in the family spoke her name with half laughter and half fear. "That woman," one cousin once whispered. "She is not normal." But the elders knew better. They said nothing, only exchanged looks heavy with memory. She was called crazy because she did not bow easily, because she asked questions when others kept their heads low. In a place where women were praised for endurance and silence, she chose a sharp tongue and straight eyes. Long ago, when things were taken from her in the name of peace, she had refused to smile. That refusal followed her like a shadow, turning courage into madness in the mouths of those who feared truth. She placed her old travel bag gently on the floor, as if it were a child sleeping. The bag was torn at the edges, its zipper tired from years of opening and closing. Inside were folded clothes that smelled of smoke and rain, a faded wrapper from the village, and small objects no one asked about but everyone noticed. Each item carried a season, a sacrifice, a road walked alone. When the young man glanced at the bag, he felt as though it carried more weight than its size allowed, like history refusing to be forgotten. "I will not stay long," she said at last, breaking the silence. 2 weeks only. That is what blood allows." The room went still. 2 weeks was not a request. It was custom. To refuse would be to spit on the faces of ancestors. The young man's mother forced a smile. "You are welcome," she replied, though her voice trembled. After that, the aunt spoke little. She sat quietly, watching. Her eyes followed conversations that ended too quickly, hands that hid nervousness, doors that closed too softly. She saw more than she said, and in her silence lived a warning, the kind that comes before storms, when the air itself knows what is coming. The aunt moved slowly through the house, her eyes resting on each face as if reading years of secrets written on their skin. She spoke softly, yet her questions struck like stones thrown into still water. "Tell me," she said, looking at the father, "who remembers the land that was promised to your uncle? Who carried the sacrifices when no one else would?" Her gaze shifted to the young man. "And you, do you know the names of those who were forgotten? The debts that were never repaid? Or do you only know comfort?" Silence followed, heavy and trembling. The questions were not meant for answers, they were meant to unearth the past, to make the air itself thick with accountability. The mother moved first, placing her hands together. "You are welcome here," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying worry. "We are honored by your presence." The smile felt forced, a polite mask. The family gathered around the aunt, folding themselves into a welcome born not of joy, but of duty. They sat quietly, serving tea and snacks, their movements careful, measured, afraid of showing any disrespect. Every gesture whispered a fear of shame, of what the neighbors would say, of how the community would judge. Yet the young man noticed something in her gaze. She did not see the house as it was. She saw what it had hidden. Every crease in a wall, every hushed conversation, every gift given too late or taken too soon, all of it was visible to her. And then, as she poured tea, her eyes met his, steady and unflinching. In that moment, he understood. This was no accidental visit. This was not curiosity or casual duty. Her arrival had a purpose, deliberate and sharp, like the strike of a drum that called the spirits to attention. The air seemed charged, as if the ancestors themselves had leaned closer to witness what would come. The young man felt it deep in his chest. This visit was a reckoning. The aunt walked through the house as though she had always belonged there. Each step was measured, quiet, yet it carried weight. She opened cupboards, ran her fingers along shelves, and let her eyes linger on corners where dust had settled too long. She did not raise her voice, did not demand attention, yet every person in the room felt the shift. Chairs seemed smaller, walls narrower, and the air heavier. Without a word, she began moving furniture. A chair here, a small table there. The young man's mother watched, unsure whether to protest. "Aunt," she whispered, "must you?" but stopped, seeing the calm in her eyes. The rearrangement was not chaos. It was a silent lesson. She claimed space not for herself alone, but to awaken memory, to remind the family that the house remembered more than they did. In the kitchen, the modern stove waited, its steel bright, its buttons untarnished. She ignored it, pulling out old clay pots, wooden spoons, and a grinding stone worn smooth by generations. Flames from the firewood licked the bottoms of pots, filling the room with smells that carried voices of ancestors. "This is how our meals speak," she said softly. "The food remembers who we are, even when we forget." The family lingered at the doorway, watching, unsure if this was hospitality or challenge. Before the first light of dawn, she moved quietly to the small courtyard. Kneeling, she whispered to shadows and dust, to unseen corners, to objects left untouched for months. Her hands traced patterns in the soil. She spoke in low tones, words meant for ears other than the living. The young man watched from the window, shivering. It was a ritual, a conversation with those who had come before, a reminder that some presences are invisible but never absent. And in that moment, the house no longer felt theirs alone. It belonged, in part, to memory, to tradition, and to the woman who refused to bend. The young man's mother smiled politely as the aunt entered the room, greeting her with a soft, "We are glad you have come." Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly. Every family member mirrored the gesture, nodding, offering tea, careful to hide the irritation growing quietly beneath their bows and courteous smiles. No one spoke the thoughts that churned like storm clouds, questions, frustrations, the desire to send her away, but silence was the law here, and respect could not be broken. Then the aunt began to speak, her voice low and gentle, yet carrying an edge no one could ignore. "Do you remember the mango tree near the old river?" she asked, eyes drifting to the young man. "I sat beneath it when your father was a child, teaching him lessons that no one else would. Do you know who carried the harvest in the rain so he could eat? Do you know who stayed awake while the wind broke the roof so that your family could sleep?" She spoke of simple days, yet her words were arrows disguised as memories. Each story carried warning, accusation, and truth wrapped in the scent of smoke and earth. The young man shifted in his seat, sensing the sharp weight behind the quiet narrative. Even the walls seemed to lean in, holding on to the weight of her stories. When she mentioned the ancestral land, the room grew heavy. "And what of the land your grandfather promised me?" she asked softly. "The soil that fed more than one generation? Who remembers it now? Who speaks of it? Who guards its name?" Every head lowered, and the air thickened. The unspoken tension filled the spaces between furniture, rattled glasses, and hovered like the scent of storm before rain. Family eyes darted nervously, avoiding each other, avoiding the truth that had sat, waiting, in quiet corners for decades. Then she spoke of her sacrifices. "I worked when my hands were blistered. I prayed when the night held fear. I gave when the family had nothing, and who noticed? Who remembered? Her voice did not rise, but it carried the weight of years. The young man felt the past press against him like the heat of midday sun. No one spoke, though her words landed like stones in each chest. Only he knew the depth of her labor and endurance. The room had grown smaller, heavier, charged with memory and the unspoken shame of forgetting. It was as if the house itself listened, and the ancestors leaned closer, watching, waiting, and knowing that the stories she carried were not just tales, they were reckoning. The aunt sat in the sunlit courtyard, her hands resting on the worn armrests of the wooden chair, a smile tugging lightly at her lips. "Do you remember the man who hid the yams while the rain came?" she asked, tilting her head. He thought no one noticed. But the frogs sang of it to the river, and the river told the trees. Her laughter was soft, but it carried a sharp edge. Every proverb, every story, danced on the line between jest and judgment, hinting at betrayals long hidden beneath polite words. The family listened, uneasy, knowing she spoke of more than simple tales. Outside, the neighbors leaned on fences and whispered. Eyes followed her every movement, tracking her from the market to the street, to the doorway of the house where she had planted her presence. Rumors began to grow like vines, twisting around corners and slipping through doorways. Some shook their heads, muttering about the crazy one who sees too much, while others cast quick, nervous glances at the young man's home, unsure what truths were about to surface. Children no longer played near the gate. Their laughter, once bright and careless, had retreated to the far corners of the compound, hidden from sight. They moved quickly when she passed, small faces pressed against walls, hands gripping the edges of doors. Even the youngest understood, instinctively, that her presence carried weight beyond their understanding. The air around the house had changed, heavy with watchfulness and the unspoken rules of respect and fear. When she met the elders, the greeting was careful. "Good morning, Aunty," one said, bowing his head slightly. Yet his eyes betrayed the unease behind the words. Another offered a nod, respectful but tense, sensing that she carried matters left unfinished, debts unpaid, promises broken, and justice delayed. The silence that followed each interaction was thick with acknowledgment. The community recognized her significance. She was not merely a visitor. She was a reckoning, a mirror held up to a family and a town that had long preferred to turn away from inconvenient truths. The young man sat by the window, sunlight spilling across the floor, yet the warmth did not reach him. His mind wrestled with a storm that had no wind and no thunder, only the weight of blood and expectation pressing down. He wanted to live freely, to follow plans drawn from his own hands, yet every fiber of his being reminded him of duty, of ancestors watching, of promises unspoken but binding. "Why must respect feel like a chain?" he whispered to himself. He traced the edges of the table, remembering the hands that had labored for this house, for this family, for a name that was not entirely his. 2 weeks had passed, yet the house felt unchanged. The young man's mother set the table for the final meal, breathing a quiet sigh of relief. "Tomorrow she will leave," she murmured, almost as if saying it enough times would make it so. The father nodded, though his hands shook slightly over the plate. The young man wanted to believe in that relief, to fold the tension away and breathe, but something in the air refused to settle. The stories, the questions, the subtle accusations, they had not ended with the calendar. The aunt's calm voice cut through the quiet like a gentle drumbeat, steady and immovable. "I am not leaving yet," she said, folding her hands in her lap. No anger, no demand, just certainty. The room froze. Eyes widened, breaths caught, and the weight of her declaration settled in every corner. The visit, they realized, was far from over. She reached for her travel bag, opened it, then paused, her fingers resting on the worn handles. "I will not pack this," she said softly, almost to herself. Some places, some truths, cannot be folded neatly and sent away. Silence gripped the room. The family understood then. The discomfort that had simmered beneath civility was now open, undeniable, and it would not be ignored. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady on the young man. "Some wrongs," she said slowly, each word deliberate, "do not leave quietly. They must speak, until justice has answered and the debt is known." The proverb hung in the air, thick as smoke from the firewood outside. It was both warning and lesson. Tradition and morality, the past and the present, converged in her quiet defiance. The household had expected an ending, but she had brought a beginning instead. The house had changed. What once felt warm and familiar now seemed to hold its breath. Doors creaked when opened, as if reluctant to admit the voices that filled the rooms. The air was heavy, thick with unspoken frustrations and quiet accusations. Even the walls seemed to lean closer, listening, carrying the weight of days that had stretched far longer than anyone anticipated. Every step across the floor echoed differently now, each movement measured, tense. The laughter that once bounced from room to room had retreated, replaced by polite nods and smiles that barely reached tired eyes. Coins disappeared from pockets, bills grew longer, and the pantry shrank faster than anyone could track. The young man's father counted once, twice, then gave up, his hands trembling as he stacked envelopes. "It was only supposed to be 2 weeks," he muttered under his breath, though no one dared answer. The aunt's presence, once merely unsettling, now pressed on the household like an invisible hand, stretching their resources and testing the limits of their patience. Even the mother, known for her calm and steadfast demeanor, wore exhaustion like a second skin. She moved through the house with polite smiles, offering meals, wiping counters, hiding the fire that burned in her chest. Each nod, each soft greeting, was a mask, concealing frustration that threatened to spill in sharp words or slammed doors. Respect demanded silence, yet silence had become heavier than ever before. The aunt spoke one afternoon at the market, recounting family tales to neighbors and passers-by. "Do you remember the night the flood took the yams?" she asked casually. "Some of us stayed awake while others slept, counting only gold, not grains." Heads nodded, children stared wide-eyed, and whispers spread like a breeze through dry grass. What had been private shame, the hidden debts, the forgotten promises, now became communal awareness, a mirror held to the family by someone who refused to look away. And with each story, long-buried secrets clawed their way to the surface. The land dispute no one mentioned at dinner was retold in vivid detail. The sacrifices made by the mother's elder brother, ignored for years, became public knowledge. Names that had been silenced for generations were spoken aloud, each syllable striking like a drumbeat, reminding the family and the community that some truths cannot remain hidden, no matter how deeply they are buried. The house, the people, the town itself, all felt the tremors of stories awakening. She sat quietly by the fire, her hands folded over each other, yet the weight of the past pressed against her like the heat of the coals. In her youth, she had given everything, her energy, her loyalty, her dreams, yet when the house fell into hardship, the blame fell squarely on her shoulders. "It was my fault," she said softly to the shadows, though no one had asked. Her sacrifices were invisible threads holding the family together, yet no one remembered to thank her, and no record bore her name. She spoke of the years spent tending to the fields while her siblings played, of nights awake with ailing relatives while others slept. "I labored," she told the young man, "and still they said it was too little, too late." Her eyes glimmered with a sorrow tempered by quiet pride, a reminder that even when unrecognized, her efforts had kept the family from ruin. Inheritance had been promised, a stretch of land meant to honor her work and preserve her voice. But quietly, it was taken away, shifted to hands more convenient, easier to control. She recalled the words of her elders, muttered in corners, "She is young, she will understand later." But later never came. The land, the respect, the rightful place she had earned, was now someone else's. When she spoke of these truths, society frowned. "Crazy," they whispered. "Troublesome woman." The village preferred comfort over confrontation, silence over accountability. Her words, though gentle, stirred shame in those who had hidden their misdeeds. Yet she did not falter. "Better to speak truth than to sleep with lies," she said, her voice steady as the rhythm of the river nearby. And still she laughed. It was not light laughter. It carried the weight of history, the sting of injustice, and the sharpness of honesty. "Do you hear the frog laugh?" she asked one afternoon, smiling knowingly at the young man. "It sings of deeds done and debts unpaid." Her humor became a shield, a way to survive the sharp eyes of judgment while letting the truth ripple outward, reaching those who would listen, reminding the family and the community that even laughter could bear the heaviest truths. The young man sat on the veranda, sunlight slicing across the worn wood floor, yet his mind was shadowed with a weight he had never carried before. As he watched his aunt carefully arrange the old pots on the stove, he realized the truth that no one had dared to say aloud. She had not chosen to leave the family years ago, she had been forced out. Memories he had accepted as fragments of the past, now stitched together into a story of betrayal and exile. "They pushed you away," he whispered, voice trembling, "and we all let it happen." The aunt, calm as a river at dusk, only nodded. "Some truths must find their own time," she said softly, eyes tracing the pattern of the sun on the veranda boards. Inside the house, the family worked their subtle manipulations, soft as honey but carrying the sting of poison. A smile here, a pointed sigh there, reminders that their comfort depended on her silence. "2 weeks, that is all," a relative muttered, though the words were heavy with expectation and guilt. They did not need to speak loudly. Their pressure was felt in glances, in the tightness of their voices, in the careful avoidance of her eyes. When whispers reached the elders, tradition became a tool to bend truth back into silence. "Remember your duty," one elder said, brow furrowed, as though invoking custom could erase wrongdoing. They recited proverbs about respect and obedience, ignoring that respect had been long denied and justice twisted to hide shame. The house felt smaller with each word, as if the walls themselves leaned in to judge. The community, sensing something unsettled, wielded shame as a weapon. Gossip floated over fences like dry leaves in wind, each word a weight on her shoulders. Neighbors avoided her, children glanced nervously, and even the marketplace seemed to hush when she passed. They sought to make her presence a burden, a lesson in conformity and quiet. But she remained unbowed. Her eyes, sharp and unflinching, saw the cracks beneath the smiles, the fear beneath the ritual greetings. She had been called crazy for speaking truths that discomfort the comfortable, for seeing the hidden patterns that others refused to face. And in her clarity, she carried the unspoken power of justice. The young man watched her, understanding now why she could not leave. The story was not finished, and until the scales balanced, silence would be a betrayal of all she had suffered. "She sees," he murmured to himself, heart pounding, "everything we pretended to forget." And in that moment, fear, respect, and revelation intertwined, setting the stage for a reckoning long overdue. The sun rose over the town like a burning promise, its light spilling across rooftops tangled with power lines, and over the dusty paths that still carried the footprints of ancestors. From the center of the village, the deep, steady sound of drums began to echo, calling not just the living, but the memories of those long gone. People moved toward the gathering place, their faces alive with expectation, unaware that today the celebration would bend into reckoning. The courtyard was adorned with garlands and carved symbols of protection. Elders sat on woven mats, children ran between adults, and the smell of roasted yams and fresh palm wine filled the air. The ceremony, meant to bless crops, marriages, and households, hummed with laughter, prayers, and songs. It was a day to honor life, not to confront its shadowed corners. Among the crowd, the aunt stood, her posture quiet yet deliberate, waiting. She held a small bundle of items wrapped in faded cloth, tokens from her youth, fragments of old promises, and reminders of sacrifices forgotten. She did not speak immediately, letting the murmurs, the music, and the rhythm of drums carry the tension through the crowd. Every eye in the courtyard, knowingly or unknowingly, was hers to claim when the moment arrived. Then, with a calmness that silenced the chatter, she began. Her voice, low and steady, carried the weight of memory and consequence. "Long ago," she said, "promises were made, hands shook, and words were spoken under the same sun that rises today. Yet some promises were broken, some hands let go too soon." Her words fell like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward. The laughter stopped, the children froze mid-step, and even the elders' eyes widened with sudden recognition. "She was pushed away," murmured one relative, barely audible, but the truth was now an ember in the open air. The crowd felt it, the weight of what had been hidden, of histories untold. The aunt's gaze swept across every face, her eyes carrying not anger, but the clarity of someone who has seen everything and waited patiently for the right moment to reveal it. "Justice," she said softly, "has always walked quietly beside us, even when we did not notice." The drums continued their call, but now they sounded different, echoing not just celebration, but confrontation, awakening, and the presence of ancestors who had never truly left. In that instant, the ceremonial joy collided with truth, and patience broke. The quiet calm of the town could not contain the storm of revelations now set free, and every heart knew that the day of reckoning had arrived. The crowd's chatter faded as the aunt's voice rose above the drums, steady and unyielding. "This house," she began, has held more than laughter and meals. It has held secrets. Secrets that began long before your hands touched these walls, before your voices named yourselves leaders of family. Her eyes scanned the gathered faces, calm yet piercing, revealing the weight of truths long ignored. Greed whispered behind closed doors, and fear kept lips sealed. Promises were made, eyes looked on, and yet silence was chosen over justice. A ripple moved through the family, subtle at first, then undeniable. The young protagonist clenched fists, feeling the tension in the air thicken like a storm ready to break. She lifted a folded parchment, brittle at the edges, and held it before all. Land was spoken of in the name of family, yet taken in the shadow of selfishness. What was promised for honor became stolen under the guise of tradition. Her voice did not quaver. It carried the authority of ancestors watching over her shoulder. An elder, usually composed, lowered his gaze. The aunt's next words carved deeper into the heart of the gathering. Promises were spoken before the elders, in sacred spaces, and buried with those who have gone. And yet, here we are, living in their absence, paying for the deceit of those who chose convenience over integrity. Faces once neutral now shifted. Eyes darted, brows furrowed, lips pressed tight. Denial trembled on their tongues, but guilt could not be hidden. Whispers of shame grew louder, echoing through the courtyard. Children looked from adults to the aunt, sensing the weight of truth beyond their understanding. "See how shame walks freely today," she said softly, yet her words carried like thunder. "Where silence once protected lies, truth now demands to be seen. Let this lesson echo through every path, every home, and every heart that thought deceit would remain hidden." The family trembled, not from anger alone, but from the recognition that history had caught up with them. In that space, between drums and dust, between tradition and justice, the veil of pretense lifted. The betrayal that had lingered in shadow now stood exposed, undeniable, and ready to shape the reckoning that was yet to come. The air trembled with the weight of unspoken truths. Murmurs turned into shouts as anger erupted, splitting the gathered crowd like thunder over dry plains. "How could you let this happen?" someone cried, fists clenched, eyes wild with disbelief. Another voice, sharp and trembling, demanded, "All these years, lies wrapped in our own hands." The courtyard buzzed with moral outrage, neighbors leaning close, unable to look away as the family's hidden sins spilled into open air. The drums, once celebratory, now seemed to echo the tension, each beat a heartbeat of confrontation. The family name hung in the balance, a fragile thread between honor and ruin. Whispers circled the gathering, some defending, some accusing, all sensing that the past's shadow now dictated the present. "If we stay silent," an elder muttered, voice thick with worry, "the weight of shame will crush us, but if we speak, will righteousness survive?" Amid the turmoil, the young protagonist felt the long history of obedience and silence pressing against her chest. She stepped forward, where previously silence had ruled, and spoke with a voice steady yet charged with emotion. "We cannot protect our image while ignoring justice," she declared, meeting eyes that flickered with surprise, guilt, and fear. "Truth must stand taller than pride." Her hands shook slightly as she revealed a small wooden box, carved with ancestral symbols, dusted with age. Inside lay a bundle of documents, faded but legible, a land marker, a deed, and notes written in careful hand long ago. "This," she said, lifting it high, "is the proof of what has been hidden. The promises made, the rights stolen, it all lies here." Gasps swept through the crowd. Skeptics leaned in, whispers became audible acknowledgment. Resistance crumbled as the evidence spoke louder than words. Eyes that had doubted now widened in shock. The aunt's face softened, not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of truth finally recognized. The whispers, once protective of lies, now turned into facts, inescapable, undeniable, and shaping a reckoning the family could no longer avoid. A hush fell over the gathering. For the first time, justice, delayed but persistent, held the floor. The young protagonist felt the weight of choice lift slightly, knowing that silence had ended, and the path toward truth, though painful, was now clear. The villagers shifted uneasily, eyes darting between the aunt and the gathered family, unsure whether to bow in respect or tremble in shame. Yet, in that moment, the whispers of madness that had followed her for decades dissolved like morning mist. Her hands, once thought frantic and uncontrolled, were steady as she spoke truths the family had buried under smiles and silence. "Courage," she said softly, yet every ear heard her, "is often mistaken for folly when it dares to defy comfort and lies." The sun rose high, casting its golden gaze on the gathering, illuminating the tension between tradition, respect, and morality. Elders, who had long been arbiters of obedience, found themselves caught between honoring rituals and acknowledging stolen justice. Mothers clasped children closer, sensing that the rules they had taught were incomplete. Even the marketplace crowd paused, feeling the weight of history and responsibility pressing against the heart of their community. "Obedience without justice is not respect," the protagonist murmured under her breath, letting the words settle in the dust-laden air. Truth rang louder than drums, resonating beyond human ears. It reached the spirits of ancestors long forgotten in the shadows of broken promises. They stirred, unseen but felt, their presence a silent applause for honesty laid bare. The aunt's eyes glimmered, not with pride, but with the solemn satisfaction of deeds set right. Families that had once hidden behind wealth and power now bowed, not in submission, but in recognition that deception cannot last when courage refuses to bend. Morning arrived with a hush that carried the weight of revelation. The house, once filled with whispers, arguments, and the tension of secrets, now held a heavy stillness. Every corner seemed to breathe differently, as if walls themselves had absorbed lessons too long ignored. Inside, the family gathered quietly, confronting their reflection in one another's eyes. Shame colored their cheeks, guilt weighed on shoulders that had carried comfort over conscience. The young protagonist stood at the center, heart steady, watching the change ripple through those who had once hidden behind polite obedience. "We see now," she said softly, "that respect without truth is only a mask, and tradition without courage is a cage." Eyes met eyes, and at last, they faced the reflection of their choices, their failures, and the path they must walk to restore honor not just in name, but in action. The air in the room was thick with words left unspoken for years. One by one, family members approached, voices trembling yet steady, each offering apologies that carried the weight of shame more than hope. "I cannot undo what has been done," said the eldest uncle, his hands folded tightly, "but I am sorry for every wrong I allowed." The aunt listened quietly, her eyes steady and calm, acknowledging the remorse without flinching. She did not nod or offer reassurance. She understood that some wounds are deeper than words can reach. Even after confessions and admissions, the atmosphere remained heavy. Relationships once taken for granted now bore cracks too wide to mend. Sister looked away, brother shifted uncomfortably, and the young ones sensed a tension that could not be softened by rituals or shared meals. The past had left its mark, and though truth now stood between them, it could not fully heal what had been broken. The aunt's voice finally rose, calm but unyielding. "I forgive," she said, not as an erasure, but as a shield. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Memory carries lessons that guilt alone cannot teach. Her words settled like gentle thunder, strong and undeniable. In her forgiveness was wisdom, not surrender. In her eyes, a quiet power that no apology could diminish. When gifts were brought, ornaments, coins, gestures meant to soothe guilt, she declined each one. "No offering can repay what was taken by silence and fear," she said, her tone firm. "Do not mistake wealth for justice. Some debts cannot be paid in gold or words." The room grew still, the unspoken truth hanging in the air. Compensation arrived too late and for the wrong reasons. Finally, she stood, the weight of her presence filling the space one last time. She collected her bag, not hurriedly, not in anger, but with the deliberate calm of someone reclaiming her life. "I leave," she said softly, "on my own terms, in my own time. This house will breathe differently now, and so will I." The family watched as she walked toward the door, her step steady, her dignity intact. Behind her, silence followed, a quiet acknowledgement that she had chosen control over chaos, and strength over resentment. The house was different now. Its walls seemed older, the ceilings lower, and the air heavier, as if the weight of years had settled in every corner. The laughter that once rang lightly through the rooms was muted, replaced by quiet footsteps and hesitant glances. Even the furniture seemed to hold its breath, as though it too had absorbed the truths spoken aloud and the long-hidden secrets that now refused to be buried. In the kitchen, the smell of yesterday's cooking lingered, faint and melancholy, marking the absence of easy joy. No celebration followed the revelations, no feast or relief. Instead, There were lessons learned quietly, carried in the hearts of those who had heard what could not be unseen. Each family member sat in reflection, feeling the slow pull of understanding that wisdom often arrives without joy. Words once whispered in fear now echoed in their minds, teaching them that knowledge is heavier than comfort, and truth heavier still. The young protagonist lingered in the doorway, watching the family with new eyes. Respect, they realized, was not mere obedience to ritual or elders. True respect required courage, the courage to challenge wrongs, the strength to question what had long been accepted. The silence that had once bound the household was now seen as complicity, and the traditions upheld without justice were exposed for what they were, shadows that protected wrongs rather than light that guided. Standing in the cool dawn, the aunt moved steadily toward the gate. She carried herself with quiet authority, her steps sure despite the softening light. Behind her, the house held its breath, older and heavier than before, but awakened in ways it could not yet understand. The horizon glowed with the first touch of sun, and in that golden light, she became a figure of balance, leaving as she had entered, with purpose, dignity, and the unshakable reminder that when tradition stands without justice, it becomes oppression. The aunt paused at the gate, her silhouette framed by the rising sun. She looked back once, her eyes soft yet unwavering, carrying the weight of lessons learned and truth spoken aloud. She did not leave destruction in her wake, no anger, no chaos, but a quiet imprint of wisdom, a reminder that courage and honesty outlast fear and deceit. The family stood behind her, still rooted to the courtyard, feeling both the emptiness of her absence and the strength she had left behind. "You will remember what must not be forgotten," she said, her voice steady as the morning breeze. "Not to punish, but to guide." As her figure disappeared down the path, the house no longer seemed merely older or heavier, it seemed awake. The air carried a subtle warmth, the kind that comes when lessons have taken root, and when hearts, however reluctantly, begin to see the truth.